Nobody expects their salvation to look like a rotting, ivy-choked Victorian mansion. For 32-year-old Sarah Jenkins, drowning in debt and facing eviction from her cramped Seattle apartment, a thick, cream-colored envelope from an attorney named Richard Davies was the lifeline she didn't know she needed. Her estranged great-aunt Mildred had died, leaving Sarah a sprawling hillside property in rural Oregon. But when Sarah and her 8-year-old son turned the rusted key in the front door, they didn't find a cozy, pastoral refuge. They found a labyrinth of locked doors, walls that seemed to hum, and a deeply buried secret that was about to upend everything they knew about their family and themselves. The eviction notice on Sarah's apartment door was a bright, offensive shade of neon pink. It was the color of a warning label, and it glared at her through the relentless Seattle drizzle. She peeled it off, folding it into tiny, sharp squares until it dug into her palm, and walked inside. On the worn hand-me-down couch, her son, Leo, was busy constructing a fortress out of cardboard boxes and duct tape. He looked up, his pale blue eyes framed by a mop of unruly brown curls. "Did the mail come, Mom?" he asked, his voice whistling slightly, a reminder of the asthma that commanded so much of Sarah's meager waitress salary at the diner. "Just junk, buddy," Sarah lied, tossing the pink square into the trash. She was drowning. Since her ex-husband, Greg, had vanished into the ether 3 years ago, leaving nothing but a mountain of credit card debt and a broken lease, Sarah had been treading water with lead weights tied to her ankles. She worked doubles, she took on freelance data entry at night, but the math simply didn't add up. They had 14 days to vacate. The next morning, the real mail arrived, bringing a letter that would change the trajectory of their lives forever. It was from the law offices of Davies and Sterling. Sarah tore it open, expecting another collection notice. Instead, she read the words, "Last Will and Testament of Mildred Hawthorne." Mildred was her maternal grandmother's sister, a woman Sarah hadn't seen since she was 6 years old. The family spoke of Millie in hushed, disapproving tones. She was the eccentric spinster who lived out in the woods, a woman who had allegedly squandered the family's modest logging fortune on frivolous nonsense and isolated herself in a house on a hill in Oak Haven, Oregon. Sarah sat in the stuffy office of Richard Davies 2 days later. He was a meticulous man who looked profoundly uncomfortable delivering the news. "Your aunt passed away peacefully in her sleep, Miss Jenkins," Davies said, sliding a heavy brass key across the mahogany desk. "She specifically named you as the sole beneficiary of the Blackwood Hill estate." "Me?" Sarah asked, staring at the key as if it might bite her. "I don't even know her. Why didn't she leave it to my mother?" "Your mother and Mildred had a permanent falling out," Davies replied smoothly, clearly trained in the art of dodging family drama. "Mildred's instructions were very clear. The house, the land, and all its contents belong to you. However, I must warn you, the property has sat largely unmaintained for the last decade. Mildred was a bit of a recluse. The house is quite isolated and unusual." Sarah didn't care if the house was made of mud and twigs. It was free, it was paid off, and it was a roof over Leo's head. "I'll take it," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of relief and sheer desperation. 3 days later, the trunk of Sarah's battered 1998 Honda Civic was packed with everything she and Leo owned. The drive down Interstate 5 was a blur of gray skies and towering evergreens. As they crossed into Oregon, the highway narrowed, winding deep into the coastal mountains. Oak Haven wasn't so much a town as it was a collection of buildings huddled together against the creeping forest. A gas station, a diner, a hardware store, and a post office. The directions Davies had given her led them 3 miles out of town, up a steep, winding dirt road that had clearly not seen a grader in years. The Civic's engine whined in protest as they climbed higher and higher, the dense canopy of Douglas firs blocking out the late afternoon sun. "Are we there yet?" Leo asked, clutching his inhaler tightly in his lap. The isolation was already making him anxious. "Almost, sweetie," Sarah said, white-knuckling the steering wheel. The trees suddenly broke, revealing a plateau carved into the side of the mountain. And there it was, Blackwood Hill. Sarah killed the engine, the silence of the forest immediately pressing in on them. The house was massive, a sprawling, asymmetrical Victorian monstrosity. It was built of dark, weathered wood that looked almost black in the fading light. Turrets jutted out at odd angles, and thick vines of dark green ivy crawled up the sides like skeletal fingers, trying to drag the structure back into the earth. The wraparound porch sagged in the middle, and half the windows were boarded up from the inside. It looked less like a home and more like a mausoleum. "Mom," Leo whispered, pressing his face against the car window. "It looks haunted." "It's just old, Leo," Sarah said, trying to inject a forced cheerfulness into her voice that she absolutely did not feel. "Nothing a little soap and water can't fix." She grabbed the heavy brass key from the console, took a deep breath of the sharp, pine-scented air, and stepped out of the car. The wooden stairs groaned in agony under her weight as she climbed to the front porch. She slid the key into the heavy iron lock. It fought her for a moment, grinding against decades of rust, before giving way with a loud, echoing clack. Sarah pushed the heavy oak door open. The smell hit her first, a suffocating wave of stale dust, dried lavender, and something distinctly metallic, like old copper coins. She reached for the light switch on the wall and flipped it. Nothing happened. The power hadn't been turned on yet. Pulling out her phone, she turned on the flashlight app and swept the beam across the entryway. The foyer was grand, featuring a sweeping mahogany staircase blanketed in a thick layer of dust. But it was the walls that made Sarah freeze. They weren't covered in wallpaper. They were covered, floor to ceiling, in framed maps. Not normal maps, but frantic, hand-drawn topographical charts, covered in red ink, connecting lines, and tiny, illegible notes. "Stay close to me, Leo," Sarah murmured as her son crept in behind her, his small hand gripping the back of her sweater. They had escaped the eviction. They had a home. But as Sarah stared at the frantic, obsessive scribbles covering the walls of her new inheritance, a cold dread settled in her stomach. They had traded one nightmare for a mystery that was far, far worse. Their first night at Blackwood Hill was an exercise in endurance. With no electricity and the sun fully set, the house plunged into an absolute, suffocating darkness. Sarah had managed to find a half-melted pillar candle in one of her moving boxes. She set up a makeshift camp for her and Leo in the center of the living room, throwing their sleeping bags over a dusty, floral-patterned rug. Leo fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the anxiety of the move, but Sarah lay awake for hours. The house was far from silent. It spoke in a language of groans, settling timber, and strange, rhythmic tapping sounds that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. Several times, she thought she heard the faint, muffled sound of a radio playing big band music from somewhere deep beneath the floorboards. But every time she strained to listen, it vanished into the wind, howling against the window panes. When morning finally broke, casting pale, gray light through the grime-caked windows, Sarah felt a renewed sense of determination. It was just a house. It was weird, and her Aunt Mildred was clearly out of her mind. But it was theirs. "All right," Sarah said, handing Leo a granola bar for breakfast. "Let's see what we're working with. You stick to the living room and draw. I'm going to map out the downstairs." Leaving Leo with his sketchpad on the front porch where the light was best, Sarah ventured deeper into the belly of the house. Past the map-covered foyer was a long hallway lined with closed doors. She opened the first one on the left. It was a parlor, but not one meant for sitting. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. The room was utterly filled with clocks. Grandfather clocks towered in the corners like wooden sentinels. Cuckoo clocks, mantle clocks, pocket watches hanging from strings pinned to the ceiling, and brass carriage clocks crowded every available surface of the bookshelves and tables. There had to be over 100 of them. She walked slowly into the room, the dust swirling around her ankles. What struck her wasn't just the sheer volume of the collection, but the eerie, unified stillness of it. None of them were ticking, and as she looked closer, shining her phone flashlight onto the faded faces of the dials, a chill ran down her spine. Every single clock, watch, and timepiece in the room was stopped at the exact same time, 4:42. "What were you doing in here, Millie?" Sarah whispered to the empty room. She reached out to touch a beautiful, ornate pendulum clock. The glass was cold. Shaken, she backed out of the parlor and closed the door tightly, as if trying to lock the anomaly inside. She moved down the hallway. The next few rooms were relatively normal, albeit filthy. A formal dining room with a long table covered in a moth-eaten lace cloth, and a massive, industrial-looking kitchen that seemed to have been updated sometime in the late 1980s. But it was the door at the very end of the hallway that gave her pause. Unlike the other doors, which were standard interior wood, this door was made of solid, reinforced steel, painted a dull, chipping grey. It looked like a door belonging to a bank vault, not a Victorian home. Sarah gripped the brass handle and pulled. It didn't budge a millimeter. She looked closer. The door wasn't just heavy, it was secured. 3 heavy-duty deadbolts ran along the side, and a massive, industrial iron padlock, the kind used for shipping containers, was bolted through a thick steel hasp in the center. Why would an elderly spinster need a reinforced steel door inside her own home? And more importantly, what was she keeping out, or keeping in? "Mom," Leo's voice echoed from the front of the house, sharp with panic. Sarah abandoned the steel door and sprinted back down the hallway, her heart hammering against her ribs. She skidded into the foyer to find Leo standing in the doorway of a small adjoining study she hadn't noticed yet. "Leo, what is it? Are you okay?" she gasped, grabbing his shoulders. "I'm fine," he said, his eyes wide. He pointed a trembling finger into the study. "But look at the desk." Sarah stepped past him into the small room. It smelled strongly of dried ink and old leather. In the center of the room sat a massive oak roll-top desk. It had been violently ransacked. Drawers were pulled out and thrown to the floor. Papers were scattered everywhere like snow, and the wooden backing of the desk had been smashed in with what looked like a crowbar. But that wasn't what had frightened Leo. Nailed to the wall directly above the desk, driven through the plaster with a 6-inch rusted spike, was a photograph. Sarah walked closer, her blood running cold. It was a photograph of her and Leo. It wasn't an old family photo. It was recent. It showed Sarah walking out of her diner in Seattle, holding Leo's hand. They were wearing their winter coats, meaning it had been taken within the last few months. Scrawled across the bottom of the photo, in thick, frantic red marker, were 3 words. "They are coming." Sarah's hands began to shake violently. She ripped the photo off the wall, the rusted spike tearing a chunk of plaster with it. Her Aunt Mildred had died a month ago. Who took this photo? Who knew they were coming here? She looked back toward the hallway, her eyes drawn to the shadows, where the steel door waited. The house wasn't just a strange inheritance. It was a trap, and she and Leo had just walked right into the center of it. "Pack your bag, Leo," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a low, urgent whisper. "We're leaving." But as Sarah turned to usher her son out the front door, the heavy oak entrance slammed shut with a deafening crash that shook the dust from the rafters. Sarah lunged for the brass knob, twisting and pulling with all her might. It wouldn't turn. The lock had engaged from the outside. They were trapped. The echo of the slamming door reverberated through the grand foyer, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. Sarah threw her entire body weight against the heavy oak, her shoulders screaming in protest, but the door felt as though it had been welded into the frame. "Mom?" Leo's voice was a fragile, terrified squeak. The characteristic wheeze of his asthma was starting to build in his chest, a sound that immediately shifted Sarah from panic to hyper-focused survival mode. "It's okay, buddy. It's just a draft." "Old houses have weird drafts," Sarah lied, her mind racing. She grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the living room. "Let's check the windows." She rushed to the massive bay windows overlooking the front porch. She unlatched the heavy brass locks and pushed up. They were painted shut. Grabbing a heavy brass candlestick from the mantel, she wrapped her sweater around her hand and brought the blunt end down, hard on the glass. Clang. The glass didn't shatter. It didn't even spiderweb. It was reinforced plexiglass, thick enough to stop a bullet. Sarah backed away, her breathing turning shallow. Whoever had lived here, whatever Aunt Mildred had become, she wasn't just eccentric. She was terrified. She had fortified the house from the inside out. "Okay," Sarah muttered, wiping a bead of cold sweat from her forehead. Okay, back door. Let's go to the kitchen. They navigated the dark, map-lined hallway again, giving the padlocked steel door a wide berth. In the kitchen, Sarah rattled the back door, locked tight, and the deadbolt required a key from the inside, a key they didn't have. "Mom, I can't breathe good," Leo gasped, leaning heavily against the island counter. "Where is your inhaler?" "In your backpack." Sarah dropped to her knees, tearing through his small canvas bag until her fingers brushed the familiar plastic L shape. She shook it, pressed it to his lips, and counted out his breaths until the terrifying wheeze subsided into a manageable rattle. "We need to find another way out," she said softly, kissing his forehead. As she stood up, her foot caught the edge of a thick, braided rug that covered the center of the kitchen floor. It bunched up, revealing something embedded in the faded linoleum beneath. It was a heavy, recessed iron ring. Sarah kicked the rug completely aside. There, completely flushed with the floor, was a trapdoor. It was roughly 3 feet square and looked incredibly heavy. "Stand back, Leo." She gripped the iron ring with both hands, planted her feet, and hauled upward. With a grating screech of rusted hinges, the door gave way, revealing a gaping maw of absolute blackness and the smell of stale air, diesel fuel, and damp earth. A wooden staircase descended into the void. She turned on her phone's flashlight. "Stay close. We might be able to find a cellar door that leads outside." The stairs groaned under their weight. As they reached the bottom, the beam of Sarah's flashlight swept across the room, and she gasped. This was not a cellar. It was a bunker. The walls were lined with cinder blocks, but they were entirely obscured by banks of ancient, heavy-duty electronics. Ham radios, oscilloscopes, and towering metal filing cabinets dominated the space. In the center of the room sat a heavy metal desk, covered in topographical maps, very similar to the ones in the foyer, but these were covered in complex mathematical equations and string lines. And in the corner, a massive, industrial diesel generator sat dormant. "Hold the light, Leo," Sarah commanded, handing him the phone. She walked over to the generator. If she could get the power on, she might be able to find a way out, or at least a landline to call Sheriff Brody Harrison, the local lawman she had seen a sign for in town. She primed the engine, grasped the pull cord, and yanked with all her strength. The engine sputtered, choked, and died. She tried again, and again. On the fourth desperate pull, the generator roared to life, spitting a cloud of black exhaust before settling into a deafening, rhythmic hum. A moment later, the overhead fluorescent lights flickered violently and buzzed to life, bathing the subterranean room in harsh, sterile white light. Sarah blinked against the brightness, her eyes adjusting to the reality of her Aunt Mildred's secret life. She walked over to the metal filing cabinets. The drawers were labeled not with bills or recipes, but with names and dates. Real, private names from Oak Haven's history. Evelyn Price, missing 1,983. Thomas Caldwell, land dispute 1,988. William Hastings, geological survey 1,991. Mildred hadn't just been a recluse. She was an investigator, or a fanatic. Sarah opened a drawer labeled Seismic Anomalies. Inside was a thick, leather-bound journal. She cracked it open. The handwriting was erratic, slashing across the pages in furious black ink. October 14th. The clock stopped again today, exactly 4:42 p.m. The magnetic interference is getting stronger. It's radiating from beneath the eastern ridge. The town thinks it's just settling mine shafts, but the frequency is wrong. It's intelligent. It breathes. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp basement air. She flipped the pages faster. November 2nd. The steel door is holding, but the scratching has started again. I need more locks. Mom? Leo was standing by the metal desk. He wasn't looking at the radios or the maps. He was looking at a small, plastic tray meant for holding mail. Look, he said, pointing a trembling finger. Sarah walked over. Inside the tray was a pristine, modern wallet made of brown leather. It looked incredibly out of place among the decades-old tech. She picked it up, her stomach twisting into a painful knot. She knew this wallet. She had bought it for an anniversary present 5 years ago. She flipped it open. Staring back at her from behind the clear plastic window was the Oregon driver's license of Gregory Jenkins, her ex-husband. The expiration date was current. Greg hadn't just abandoned them to run off to a new state. He had come here, to Blackwood Hill, and according to the layer of dust on the wallet, he had never left. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Greg was here? Why? How did he even know about Aunt Mildred? When he abandoned them in Seattle, he had drained their joint savings, leaving a cruel, one-line note on the kitchen counter. I found a better bet. Had Mildred's estate been the better bet? "Mom, is that Dad's?" Leo asked, his voice trembling. He barely remembered his father, only the loud arguments and the lingering smell of cheap beer and stale cigarettes. "I don't know, Leo. I don't know," Sarah said, shoving the wallet into her jeans pocket. She couldn't process this right now. Survival had to take precedence over the shock. She frantically scanned the bunker walls until she spotted what she was looking for. A set of sloped concrete stairs leading up to a pair of heavy wooden storm doors. She sprinted up the concrete steps and shoved her weight against the wood. It was padlocked, but unlike the reinforced front door, the wood here was rotted from years of damp Oregon weather. "Stand back," Sarah yelled. She raised her foot and kicked furiously at the latch. The wood splintered. She kicked again, her boot driving through the decaying timber. With a final, desperate heave of her shoulders, the iron latch tore free from the rotted wood, and the storm doors burst open. Cold, driving rain immediately soaked them. Sarah grabbed Leo, hauling him up out of the bunker and into the fading gray light of the late afternoon. They scrambled up the muddy embankment, slipping and sliding on wet pine needles until they reached the gravel driveway. Sarah pulled her keys from her pocket, her eyes locked on the Honda Civic. They just needed to get in, lock the doors, and drive until they hit the interstate. "Going somewhere?" The voice was deep, gravelly, and came from the shadows of the porch. Sarah screamed, spinning around and shoving Leo behind her. Standing beneath the sagging awning of the wraparound porch was a man. He looked to be in his late 60s, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a yellow slicker that was slick with rain. In his right hand, angled casually toward the ground, was a double-barreled shotgun. "Who are you?" Sarah demanded, her voice shrill with terror. "Get away from us. I'll call the police." The man slowly raised his free hand in a placating gesture. "Phone lines have been dead up here since the storm of '08, and cell service doesn't reach past the ridge," he said mildly. He stepped out into the rain, letting the hood of his slicker fall back to reveal a weathered, deeply lined face and a mop of salt and pepper hair. "My name is Donovan Hayes," he said. "I own the property down at the bottom of the access road. I keep an eye on things. Mildred said you'd be coming." "Mildred is dead," Sarah snapped, her eyes darting between Donovan and the car. "I know," Donovan said, a shadow crossing his eyes. "I'm the one who found her. Did you manage to get out through the root cellar?" "I told her chaining those storm doors from the inside was a fire hazard." Sarah hesitated. He didn't seem entirely threatening, but he was holding a gun. "Why are you carrying that?" She pointed at the shotgun. Donovan looked down at the weapon as if he had forgotten he was holding it. "Bears," he grunted, "and other things that come around when the mountain gets restless. You shouldn't be out here in the dark, Sarah. How do you know my name? Millie talked about you. Said you were the only family she had left that wasn't corrupted by the town's nonsense." Donovan sighed, resting the butt of the shotgun on the toe of his boot. "I tried to warn her, you know. I told her to leave that damn door alone." Sarah's blood ran cold. The steel door in the hallway. Donovan nodded slowly. She spent 30 years trying to map the tunnels under this hill. Believed the old mining company didn't abandon Oakhaven because the silver dried up. She believed they dug into something they shouldn't have, something that creates a localized magnetic field, stops clocks, scrambles compasses. "That's insane," Sarah breathed, clutching Leo tighter. "Maybe," Donovan said, "but the people who went looking for the source of that field never came back. Thomas Caldwell, Evelyn Price, and 3 years ago, a young guy from Seattle. Sarah felt the earth tilt beneath her feet. "Greg," she whispered. Donovan's eyes locked onto hers, filled with a grim sympathy. He showed up at the local tavern flashing a forged deed to Blackwood Hill. Said he was the rightful owner. He came up here one night while Millie was in town buying supplies. I saw his truck parked out front. By the time I came up to check on things, his truck was gone. But he wasn't. "What are you saying?" Sarah demanded, her voice cracking. "I'm saying," Donovan replied, pointing a calloused finger toward the dark, looming silhouette of the house, "that your husband managed to get that steel door open, and whatever is on the other side, it kept him." A loud, metallic clang suddenly echoed from inside the house, cutting through the sound of the driving rain. It sounded like heavy iron striking steel. Donovan's grip tightened on his shotgun. He looked at Sarah, his expression hardening into terrifying resolve. "You need to leave, Sarah," Donovan said urgently. "Right now. Get in your car and drive." But before Sarah could move, the heavy oak front door of the house, the one that had locked them inside just an hour ago, slowly, deliberately, swung open on its own, revealing the pitch-black hallway within. From the darkness, a voice called out. It was hoarse, raspy, and sounded like it hadn't been used in years. "Sarah?" It was Greg's voice. The rain suddenly felt like ice against Sarah's skin. The gravel crunched under her boots as she instinctively took a step backward, pushing Leo securely behind her legs. The heavy oak front door of Blackwood Hill stood wide open, a gaping black maw against the dreary Oregon twilight. "Sarah," the voice echoed again, followed by a wet, ragged cough. It was undeniably Greg's voice, but it lacked the arrogant, sharp edge it had possessed 3 years ago. It sounded hollowed out, scraped raw by fear and exhaustion. "Mom?" Leo whimpered, his fingers digging painfully into the back of Sarah's thighs. "Is that Dad?" Donovan raised the shotgun, leveling the double barrels directly at the dark doorway. The safety clicked off with a sharp, metallic snap that seemed deafening in the quiet forest. "I don't know what's in there, Sarah, but if it's been locked behind that steel door for 3 years, it ain't your husband anymore. We need to get in my truck. Now." But the paralyzing grip of shock had already been broken by an overwhelming, terrifying curiosity. How could he be alive? No food, no water, trapped behind a bank vault door in a house of stopped clocks. "Greg?" Sarah called out, her voice trembling but surprisingly loud. "Step out into the light. Show yourself." A figure emerged from the shadows of the foyer. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. Donovan cursed under his breath, keeping the gun trained on the man's chest. It was Greg Jenkins, but he was practically unrecognizable. He looked as though he had aged 15 years. His once immaculate sandy blonde hair was long, matted, and streaked with stark white. His clothes, the designer jeans and expensive leather jacket he had worn the day he abandoned them, were filthy, torn, and hanging off a frame that had lost at least 40 pounds. But it was his eyes that truly terrified Sarah. They were wide, bloodshot, and frantic, darting around the porch and the rainy driveway as if he expected the trees themselves to attack him. "Sarah," Greg wept, collapsing to his knees on the threshold. He didn't seem to notice the rain driving onto the porch or the shotgun pointed at him. "You came. I knew you would come. The machine, it said the bloodline had to return." "Dad?" Leo whispered, stepping out from behind Sarah before she could stop him. Greg's head snapped up at the sound of the boy's voice. A heartbreaking mixture of recognition and utter confusion washed over his gaunt face. "Leo? My God, Leo, you're so big. How long has it been?" 3 years, Greg, Sarah said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. The fear was receding, rapidly replaced by the familiar, hot fury of a mother left to clean up his mess. "You abandoned us 3 years ago. What are you doing here? Did you break into Aunt Millie's house?" 3 years? Greg repeated, ignoring her questions. He stared at his trembling, dirt-caked hands. No, that's impossible. It's only been a few weeks, a month, tops. The pressure valves. I was just fixing the pressure valves. Donovan took a slow step up onto the porch, never lowering the weapon. Time doesn't work right behind that door, Sarah. I tried to tell you. The magnetic field down there warps things. Don't listen to him, Greg suddenly shrieked, pointing a skeletal finger at Donovan. He doesn't understand. The old man, Josiah Blackwood, he built it down there, under the hill. It wasn't a silver mine, Sarah. It was a cage. Get up, Greg, Sarah commanded, her waitress instincts kicking in the tone she used to manage unruly, drunk customers at 2 a.m. We are leaving. I don't care about a cage, or a machine, or Josiah Blackwood. We are getting in my car, and I am calling Sheriff Harrison the second we hit the interstate. Greg scrambled to his feet, but he didn't move toward the car. Instead, he lunged backward into the foyer, grabbing the heavy oak door. We can't leave, he screamed, his eyes locking onto Sarah's with terrifying intensity. The clock stopped again. Sarah, don't you see? 4:42. The pressure is building. Mildred is gone, and I can't read the schematics. If the pendulum stops swinging, the fault line cracks. It will take Oak Haven, the highway, the whole damn mountain. Only the Hawthorne blood can reset the cipher. Before Sarah could process a word of his manic rant, a deep, resonant vibration shook the ground beneath their feet. It wasn't an earthquake. It felt rhythmic, mechanical, like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant directly beneath the floorboards. The heavy plexiglass windows of the living room rattled violently in their frames. The dust on the porch shifted, dancing in strange, swirling geometric patterns. Sarah! Donovan yelled over the sudden, low-frequency hum filling the air. The mountain is waking up. Greg disappeared into the dark hallway, leaving the front door wide open. Mom, what do we do? Leo cried, clamping his hands over his ears to block out the oppressive humming sound. Sarah looked at her son, then at her battered Honda Civic, and finally into the gaping dark of her inheritance. If she ran now, maybe they could outdrive whatever cataclysm was building beneath Blackwood Hill. But if Greg wasn't entirely insane, if a fault line truly was about to give way, running wouldn't save them. Donovan, Sarah said, her voice deadly calm. Keep that gun loaded. We're going in. The air inside the house had fundamentally changed. It felt thick, charged with static electricity that made the hair on Sarah's arms stand on end. The rhythmic tapping she had heard the night before was back, but it was no longer muffled. It was a deafening, metallic pounding echoing from the end of the hallway. They moved quickly, Sarah clutching Leo's hand, Donovan taking point with the shotgun. They reached the end of the hall. The reinforced steel vault door was standing wide open. The heavy industrial padlock had been melted off, leaving a puddle of slag on the hardwood floor. Beyond the door wasn't a room, but a cavernous, spiraling descent. A heavily modified spiral staircase made of wrought iron and modern steel scaffolding plunged down into a cavern illuminated by harsh, flickering tungsten bulbs. The smell of ozone, hot oil, and ancient, damp earth was overwhelming. Stay close to the wall, Donovan warned, his boots ringing on the metal-grated steps. As they descended, the scale of the subterranean space revealed itself, stealing the breath from Sarah's lungs. The cavern was easily the size of a football field, vaulted by natural rock that had been shored up by massive, riveted steel beams. But it was what filled the cavern that defied all logic. It was a machine of impossible proportions. Towering brass gears, some 30 feet in diameter, ground against one another with agonizing slowness. Massive glass vacuum tubes, the size of mature oak trees, pulsed with a sickly, violet light. Thick bundles of copper wiring crawled across the stone floor like copperhead snakes, converging on a central, elevated platform. It was a nightmare of Victorian engineering, fused with terrifying, incomprehensible science. What is this place? Sarah whispered, the sound entirely lost beneath the roar of the machinery. Josiah Blackwood's folly, Donovan yelled back over his shoulder. He bought this mountain in 1892, claimed he found a magnetic anomaly that could generate infinite wireless power. He spent his entire fortune building this engine to harness it. Did it work? She asked. Too well. a voice answered from below. They reached the floor of the cavern. Greg was standing by a massive, polished, mahogany control console on the central platform. He was frantically flipping heavy brass switches and turning pressure valves, his hands moving in a blur of desperate panic. "It taps directly into the Earth's electromagnetic field," Greg shouted, not looking up from the console. "But it's a feedback loop. It draws power, but it also anchors the tectonic plates. Josiah didn't build a generator, Sarah. He built a planetary pacemaker. And it's failing." Sarah marched up onto the platform, grabbing Greg by his tattered collar and forcing him to look at her. "Stop talking in riddles. Why are you here? Why didn't you just leave 3 years ago?" Greg's eyes filled with tears, a rare moment of lucidity piercing through his madness. "I found a letter in your things, Sarah, from your mother, about Aunt Millie's hoard. I thought she was sitting on gold or silver from the old mines. I came to take it, to pay off my debts." He gestured wildly to the towering gears. "I broke the lock. I came down here, but the door slammed shut behind me. And down here, time stretches. A day up there is a month down here. Mildred kept me alive. She slid food through a chute. She told me I was serving a higher purpose. But then, the food stopped coming. Aunt Mildred had died. She had died in her sleep, leaving Greg trapped in a time-dilated nightmare beneath the earth, desperately trying to keep a 130-year-old doomsday machine from tearing itself apart. "Look!" Leo suddenly yelled, pointing toward the center of the console. Encased in a thick cylinder of reinforced glass was a massive, brass pendulum. It was swinging back and forth, but the arc was erratic, shuddering and fighting against some invisible force. Directly above the pendulum was a large, analog clock face. The hands were ticking, slowly, painfully, toward 4:42. "The magnetic interference peaks at 4:42, Greg babbled, grabbing his hair. "If the pendulum stops completely, the kinetic energy backlashes into the fault line. It's an 8.0 earthquake, minimum. It's what happened in 1983. Evelyn Price was the caretaker then. She failed to vent the pressure. It caused the landslide that wiped out the old highway." "How do we stop it?" Donovan demanded, racking a shell into the chamber of the shotgun, as if he could shoot the abstract concept of a localized apocalypse. "I can't," Greg screamed. "I don't have the biometric clearance." Josiah locked the master release. "It only responds to the specific biological frequency of the Hawthorne-Blackwood bloodline. Mildred was Josiah's granddaughter. Your mother was next in line, Sarah, but she ran away." Greg grabbed Sarah's shoulders, his grip like a vice. "That's why Mildred left you the house. She knew her heart was failing. She needed a replacement. You have the blood, Sarah. You have to trigger the manual override, or we all die under this mountain." The violent humming of the cavern abruptly shifted into a high-pitched, agonizing squeal of metal on metal. Sparks showered from the upper scaffolding as a 30-foot gear ground to a sudden, terrifying halt. The clock above the pendulum clicked loudly. Sidar Sisyphon. 2 minutes. They had 2 minutes before the machine tore the mountain and everything on it apart. Sarah looked at the console. There was no keyboard, no modern screen, just a large, circular depression in the center of the brass control panel, lined with dozens of razor-sharp, microscopic silver needles. A blood lock, Sarah realized, feeling the blood drain from her face. Josiah engineered a 19th century DNA scanner. "Put your hand on it, Sarah," Greg pleaded. "Push down. Let it read you. It's the only way to vent the primary steam valves." Sidian Sushiyifen. The ground heaved violently, throwing Leo to the floor. Donovan caught the boy, sheltering him against a steel beam. The noise in the cavern was now deafening, a physical pressure pushing against their eardrums. The giant vacuum tubes began to crack, the violet light strobing wildly. Sarah stood before the brass console. She was a waitress. She was a mother trying to keep her kid fed and housed. She was not a savior, and she certainly wasn't an engineer of apocalyptic Victorian machinery. But as she looked at Leo, trembling in Donovan's arms, the choice evaporated. This house wasn't a gift. It was a curse. a generational burden passed down in the dark. But it was hers now. She raised her right hand, hovering it over the circle of silver needles. 4, 41, and 40 seconds. The cavern was shaking so violently that the massive, iron-riveted support beams began to scream, shedding thick flakes of century-old rust like metal snow. The violet light pulsing from the towering glass vacuum tubes flickered erratically, casting long, monstrous shadows across the stone walls. Sarah didn't look at Greg. She didn't look at the monstrous brass gears grinding toward their apocalyptic halt. She looked down at Leo, who was buried against Donovan's yellow rain slicker, his small hands clamped over his ears, his face pale with a terror no 8-year-old should ever know. She was a mother. There was no other choice. Sarah slammed her right hand down onto the circular depression in the center of the mahogany console. The pain was immediate and blinding. Dozens of microscopic silver needles pierced the flesh of her palm, driving deep into the muscle and vein. She cried out, her knees buckling, but a mechanical whir echoed from inside the console. A heavy brass ring snapped upward, clamping down viciously over her wrist like a manacle, locking her arm in place. "Mom!" Leo screamed, trying to break away from Donovan, but the older man held him back. "Don't touch it. Let her go." Beneath the glass of the console, Sarah watched in horror as thick, translucent capillaries began to draw her blood. It flowed out of her, glowing a faint, unnatural crimson in the harsh light, feeding directly into the heart of Josiah Blackwood's machine. "It's reading the sequence," Greg shouted, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. "The biometric cipher is accepting the Hawthorne lineage." 4:41 and 55 seconds. A deafening hiss of pressurized steam erupted from the perimeter of the cavern. The massive, 30-foot brass gear that had ground to a halt suddenly shuddered. Sidian Sishararfan. The giant clock face above the pendulum ticked perfectly into place. But the pendulum didn't stop, empowered by the genetic key of its creator's bloodline. The heavy brass weight swung smoothly past the center point, completing its arc. The agonizing squeal of metal vanished, replaced instantly by a deep, rhythmic, stabilized hum. The violet tubes flared with brilliant, steady light. The violent shaking of the cavern subsided into a gentle, almost imperceptible vibration. The machine had vented the tectonic pressure. The mountain was safe. Sarah exhaled a ragged breath, the adrenaline leaving her body in a rush. "Okay," she gasped, her voice trembling. "Okay, we did it. Greg, how do I release the clamp?" Greg didn't answer. He was staring at her hand, his face completely drained of color. "Greg," Sarah demanded, pulling against the brass ring. It didn't yield a millimeter. The needles remained buried in her palm, a continuous, dull ache radiating up her arm. "How do I turn it off?" "You don't," Greg whispered, backing away from the console. He looked like a man who had just realized he had traded one circle of hell for a much deeper one. Mildred's journals. I didn't understand them until now. I thought she just chose to isolate herself. I thought she was just paranoid. "What are you saying?" Donovan barked, stepping up to the platform, his shotgun still tightly gripped in his hands. "The machine doesn't just need a key," Greg said, his voice cracking. "It needs an anchor, a biological conductor to process the localized magnetic field. If the anchor leaves, the feedback loop breaks, the pressure builds again." He looked up at Sarah, tears spilling over his dirty, hollowed cheeks. "Mildred didn't stay in the house, Sarah. She was chained to it, and now it has you." Panic, cold, and absolute seized Sarah's chest. She pulled frantically, planting her boots on the edge of the console and heaving with all her might, but the Victorian steel was unyielding. She was tethered to the mountain. She was the new Mildred. "No," she screamed. "No, I have a son. I can't stay down here. Donovan, break it. Shoot it." Donovan rushed forward, wedging the heavy steel barrels of his shotgun beneath the brass manacle, trying to use it as a lever. He strained, the muscles in his neck cording, but the mechanism was flawless. "I can't budge it," Donovan grunted, stepping back. "If I shoot the console, the buckshot will take your arm off, Sarah." "I don't care. Do it," she sobbed, looking back at Leo, who was standing at the edge of the platform, crying silently. "I am not leaving my son." Greg looked at his ex-wife, then at his son. 3 years. He had spent 3 years in the dark, eating canned rations, descending into madness, driven only by the selfish desire to steal an inheritance that turned out to be a curse. He had ruined their lives in Seattle, and now his cowardice had led Sarah into a permanent prison. A sudden, strange calm washed over Greg's face. The frantic, manic energy that had consumed him vanished. He reached down and picked up a massive, solid iron wrench that lay abandoned on the grated floor. "Greg, what are you doing?" Donovan asked, stepping back. "Josiah Blackwood built this to save the town," Greg said softly, his eyes fixed on the towering glass vacuum tubes that powered the central relay. "But no one should have to carry the weight of a mountain. Not Mildred. And definitely not you, Sarah." "Greg, wait," Sarah yelled. He didn't wait. With a guttural roar, Greg swung the heavy iron wrench with every ounce of his remaining, emaciated strength. He didn't hit the console. He struck the primary violet vacuum tube directly above the biometric relay. The glass shattered with the force of a bomb. A blinding arc of violet electricity exploded outward, striking Greg directly in the chest and throwing him backward off the platform. The console sparked violently, the intricate brass gears inside smoking and seizing. With a sharp clack, the brass manacle around Sarah's wrist sprang open. She fell backward, clutching her bleeding hand to her chest. The cavern was instantly plunged into chaos. Without the central relay, the machine lost its synchronization. The gears began to grind against each other, snapping massive steel teeth that flew through the air like shrapnel. "The feedback loop is broken," Donovan roared over the deafening noise. "The whole system is overloading. It's going to blow." Sarah scrambled to the edge of the platform and looked down. Greg was lying on the stone floor, his clothes smoking, his eyes staring blankly up at the vaulted ceiling. He wasn't moving. "Greg!" Sarah screamed, reaching out for him. "He's gone, Sarah." Donovan grabbed her by the shoulders, physically hauling her away from the edge. "We have to go. Now." He grabbed Leo with his free arm, and together, the three of them sprinted for the spiral staircase. The ascent was a nightmare. The ground heaved beneath them, not with the natural rhythm of an earthquake, but with the violent, explosive death throes of the Blackwood engine. Steam pipes burst, filling the cavern with scalding white clouds. They hit the cinderblock bunker, scrambling up the concrete stairs and bursting through the shattered wooden storm doors, just as a massive explosion echoed from deep within the earth. They ran blindly through the driving rain, sliding on the muddy driveway, until they reached Donovan's heavy-duty pickup truck parked at the bottom of the property line. Donovan threw Leo into the back seat, shoved Sarah into the passenger side, and slammed his foot on the gas. As the truck tore down the winding dirt road, Sarah looked out the window back at Blackwood Hill. The earth beneath the massive Victorian mansion simply gave way. The cavern roof, weakened by the exploding machinery, collapsed inward, with a terrifying groan of splintering timber and shattering glass. The front half of the house sank rapidly into a massive sinkhole, swallowed by the mountain it had guarded for over a century. The stopping of the clocks, the hum in the walls, the legacy of Josiah Blackwood, it was all buried beneath thousands of tons of Oregon rock and soil. Sarah pulled her bleeding hand to her chest, the rain beating against the truck window. She looked into the back seat where Leo was curled up, safe and breathing evenly. The nightmare was over. The destruction of the Blackwood estate made regional news, officially classified as a severe, localized sinkhole caused by abandoned 19th century mining tunnels. Nobody questioned the official narrative, and Sarah certainly wasn't going to correct them. The state purchased the remaining stable acreage from her at a premium, eager to secure the hazardous land. With the money, Sarah paid off her crushing debts and bought a small, sunlit house in the suburbs of Portland, far away from the imposing shadows of coastal mountains. Donovan Hayes became a quiet fixture in their lives, occasionally driving up to share Sunday dinners, a silent guardian who understood the weight of the secret they shared. Sarah never spoke of Greg's fate to the authorities, choosing instead to let Leo remember his father's final, redeeming act of sacrifice rather than the man who had abandoned them. They had lost everything they brought to that hill, but in the ruins of a terrifying inheritance, Sarah and her son had finally found their freedom